Okay, this is the Chapter 21 outline for AP US History. It's called The Emergence of Urban America. So the second half of the 19th century, there was a lot of city growth. The urban population went from 6 million to 44 million, and half of the nation's population was living in urban areas. America's moved to town, so cities had good jobs and a social life, as opposed to in rural areas where it was just your family and there weren't a lot of people around, so that attracted a lot of people. Okay, explosive urban growth. So westward expansion meant that more towns were popping up, which meant when these towns grew bigger, they were turning into cities. The Pacific coast was mostly urban, and that was because of the San Francisco, and the big cities were San Francisco and Los Angeles, and these were made possible by the Southern Pacific Railroad and Santa Fe Railroads. Northwest, the cities that developed were Seattle, Denver, Kansas City, and Omaha. In the South, Durham, Birmingham, and Houston developed as big cities. 90% of Manhattan lived in tenements. So this is, you start to get an idea of what city life was like, and tenements were congested, multi-story apartment buildings. But some good things were the heating developments that came out of it, there were heating developments which allowed people to live in these tenements. The Otis Elevator Company allowed for tall buildings to be built because people wouldn't have to walk as much, and iron and steel buildings allowed for buildings to be sturdier, which led to skyscrapers. So cable cars and electric trolleys and subways allowed for horizontal expansion, because right now we're seeing vertical expansion with the skyscrapers in cities, but now we're seeing horizontal expansion because it was cheaper to commute. And what happened was Center City was filled with the poor workers who couldn't afford to commute, so they had to live in the center of the city near the factories, while the outer city was filled with the wealthier or wealthy-ish workers, and they could afford to commute. The allure and problems of the cities. So people went to cities because there was good work, there was a social life, and there was some social freedom there. There are a lot of problems like crowded apartments, and out of the 42,700 tenements, 1.6 million people lived in there, so obviously really cramped conditions. There was a lot of sanitation, health, and morale problems. There's no place for children to play. Odors were pretty bad. There were lots of deaths. There was no space. And they tried to fix this by building up instead of out, because obviously you're not going to be flying around in the air. You need space on land, so they're like, oh, let's just build up instead of horizontally, but it didn't really work that well. City politics. So political machines started to develop, and what they basically did were it was a certain political party took power, and they gave patronage favors, or they just pretty much gave city government jobs to people who supported the company. They were very corrupt, and they would buy votes, and they would have pre-filled out ballots, and they would just stuff the ballot boxes, and it was really corrupt. But they did some good things like distributing food, coal, and money, and they found jobs for people. They had English language classes, and they helped start sports and social clubs. Cities and the environment. In cities there was a lot of disease. It was noisy, it was smelly. There was a lot of garbage and contaminated water, and there were a lot of water-related diseases like cholera, typhoid, and yellow fever. And so there were some sanitary reforms that started to come about. What they did was they banished hogs and cattle. There were a lot of cleanup campaigns. They separated the water and sewage systems, and they had flush toilets. And there was a lot of new implementations of trash collection. They also replaced horses with streetcars, which means there weren't as many dead carcasses and there wasn't as much poop and pee. And then they sold manure from the horses to farmers, and they also sold some people's manure to farmers. But some bad things that came out of this was people were like, oh, when I flush the toilet, it's going into the ocean. But what they didn't realize was it was being purified before that. So people who didn't have toilets would just dump the poop in the water, which was bad. And so that's why some waterborne diseases were still around. Cities attracted immigrants, so the new immigration. 1/7 of Americans were foreign born, so 1 out of every 7. and immigrants populated cities instead of rural areas. Americans pull, so the Europeans wanted to go from farms to cities, and in the cities they lived in their ethnic groups. There were 4/5 of New Yorkers were foreign-born, and a lot of times they were pushed out by bad conditions in their home country, like religious persecution or just bad economy. But more often they were pulled by things they saw in America instead of being pushed out of their country. And because America needed cheap labor, and there was the Contract Labor Act of 1864, which allowed for businesses to import contracted labor, so they would be like, it was basically indentured servitude. They'd be like, hey, I'll pay for you to come over to America and I'll give you a job. But their working conditions were really crappy and they didn't get paid a lot. And this act was quickly repealed. And immigration started to increase post-Civil War. And this time it was from Eastern and Southern European immigrants, like Italians, Czechs, Poles, Russians, Greeks, and most of these immigrants were Jewish or Catholic. Ellis Island. So the development of Ellis Island occurred when money makers started to rip off, or money changers started to rip off immigrants. So they would change the exchange rate. So you gave them €1, even though Europe didn't really use euros as uniformly as they do now at this time. But if you gave them €1, they would give you half a dollar, and the exchange rates were really corrupt. So America developed the Bureau of Immigration Organization, or the Bureau of Immigration, which organized this so immigrants wouldn't get ripped off. And what they did was they started Ellis Island in New York, where all the immigrants who were coming on ships would go, at least from the east. And the immigrants obviously came over by boat, and the first and second class immigrants, the people who were on the first and second class of the ship, they didn't need to go to Ellis Island because they would have people come on the ships and just check them out and get them naturalized or whatever there. But if the poor immigrants who couldn't really afford to be in first and second class, and they kind of jumped on the boat last minute and just paid just to live in, they lived in the steerage compartment, they needed to go to Ellis Island to get papers to be legal in America. So making their way, so they didn't speak English, which means they were easily exploited. And once they got off of Ellis Island, they were greeted with jobs, but these jobs exploited them. And there were a lot of Chinatowns and little Italies that popped up, so people would stay with their ethnic groups and live with them. Okay. The nativist response. So native-born Americans saw all these immigrants as a threat because they were taking jobs and they were accepting cheaper pay, and the nativists felt superior, and they were very anti-Catholic, Buddhist, and Jewish. They're very Protestant. So what they did was they started the American Protective Association, which set restrictions on immigration. This is the things that they wanted. They restricted immigration. They wanted tougher naturalization laws or requirements. And they wanted businesses to refuse to hire immigrants or Catholics, and they wanted the American language taught in schools. Immigrant restrictions. So whenever Congress or the American Protective Association tried to pass restrictions, presidents would veto it, but eventually Congress overrode it. But the only thing that they overrode was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which lasted from 1882 to 1943, so the Chinese weren't allowed in. But there were some exceptions to this, and Angel Island is the Ellis Island of the West, because Ellis Island was in New York, and so this is in California. And Chinese could enter the country if they could prove that they had a Chinese-American parent in the country, which wasn't very likely and was very difficult to do, but still some Chinese got in. Popular culture. So now we're starting to get into what people did in their free time if they had free time and weren't working. And people who had free time were the rich whites and rich urban free whites who could afford cheap entertainment, and their entertainment included politics. A lot of people got involved in politics because it was entertaining, and labor unions started providing activities. One of the big things that developed was vaudeville, which were basically just variety shows, and they were plays accompanied by music. That's vaudeville translate directly into French as plays accompanied by music, but they're variety shows. And They had comedians, singers, musicians, farcical plays, animals, acts, gymnasts, dancers, and magicians there. And it attracted all audiences, men, women, and children of all races and class. Saloon culture. So urban working classes had social clubs, and they were basically saloons. Like, that's what they did in saloons. Saloons offered food, drink, companionship, and they could talk about politics. And a lot of times, politicians would come into saloons and talk and preach and stuff. And in saloons, the men could learn about jobs, labor unions. They could pass their paychecks. They could mail stuff out. They could read their newspapers. They could gossip. A lot of tenements had really bad restrooms, so a lot of people would go into saloons for restrooms. And saloons actually developed gymnasiums for games like handball, and they also had like cards and some board games. And saloons were basically just man caves, and they received a lot of criticism from anti-liquor societies because there was a lot of drinking there. Outdoor recreation. So to get out of the cramped conditions, cities started to offer parks. They started making just green stuff, basically. And in these parks, there were tennis courts, and you could ride your bicycle. But these tennis clubs and bikes were only for the rich. So the poor, what they did to get outside was they would just stand on street corners. They would form musical groups. They would play instruments, and they would drink. And there was some boxing and baseball going on. It wasn't professional yet. Working and leisure, it says working men and leisure, but that should be working women and leisure. So working women had really domestic duties. They washed clothes, they went shopping, they babysat or took care of children. But single women had a lot more freedom. They went to dance halls, amusement parks, picnics, and they went to the movies. They went to beaches, and they were pretty much just sluts because they could sleep around with whoever they wanted, and there was like cheap entertainment for them. So sports were starting to become pretty big now. So this section was called spectator sports. College football and basketball are starting to arise. Pro baseball is starting to arise. And sports unified ethnic groups because you didn't need to talk to understand baseball or anything. You could just watch. There were no words involved. There was some college football going on. Basketball was invented and it was very popular, and it was invented by the men. First basketball league was in the Men's Christian Association. And in baseball, you had the Knickerbocker Baseball Club of New York, and the first baseball team was the Cincinnati Red Stockings. And the Major League baseball teams were reserved for whites, and the minor leagues were for blacks. And sports became very popular, and this actually led to the revival of the Olympic Games. Education and the professions, the spread of public education. So the whole point of public education and the whole push for it was we need to Americanize immigrant children because we don't like all these different ethnic groups. Everyone needs America. And so there were a lot more colleges because a lot more people were enrolled in public school, so they felt they could go on to secondary education. And enrollment really started to skyrocket post-Civil War. Along with these public schools, there was a lot of vocational training schools. It was mainly for African Americans in the South, and the Morrill Act of 1862 gave money to states for agricultural and mechanic schools, and these were known as land-grant colleges. Higher education, so there were more colleges, but what they did was the colleges, since more people were attending, they were we need to diversify, so you can choose electives, so then people would just choose easy classes. So it's pretty much everyone was taking easy classes. So if that was in high school, imagine everyone taking sewing. I don't know if that's a hard class, but cooking, that's a fun class that you don't really have to try, and there's not a lot of homework. And colleges slowly integrated women. They didn't really allow them at first, but now they slowly started allowing them. But then they started having grad schools which focused on one subject, and it was pretty rigorous, unlike colleges. The rise of realism. So during this time, there was less focus on romanticism and spirituality and religion, and more focus on the daily life than eternal life. So they were thinking, okay, what am I going to do today, instead of how am I going to go to heaven or hell or whatnot. So and there was really a focus on modern science that went against religion. So theories of social change, one of the big ones at the time was Darwinism, which was natural selection. Hopefully we all know what that is. And radical religions rejected evolution, so people who were like really hardcore about their faith were like, no, that's wrong. But a lot of people were like, oh yeah, that makes sense. You know what, like, how about we can say that like God made natural selection? So they like incorporated science into their religion. Social Darwinism was one of the big new like schools of thought almost during the time, and what they did was they applied natural selection to social life. So they said that society was evolving and natural selection was going to eventually bring it to perfection, and they didn't want government intervention because it's natural selection, so it needs to be natural, not regulated by the government. And they viewed the government's help as helping the unfit survive, which kind of goes against natural selection, so it was slowing down the perfection of society. And this was led by Herbert Spencer, and he said that tycoons and monopolies are the fittest, so we need those because that follows social Darwinism and because survival of the fittest, so we can't bring the fittest down by regulating stuff. Then we have Reform Darwinism, which was led by Lester Frank Ward, and what he said was we need to use the government to help the social revolution speed it up, because they can get rid of poverty and promote education, which would improve the brain, so natural selection, we're going to create more smart people. We have pragmaticism. I don't really think the book does a pretty good job of explaining it. I would just look it up on Wikipedia or something to get a better understanding, because I still don't really understand it. But it was led by William James, and the book says, and these are quotes from the book, that ideas are good from social consequences and practical applications. You have to judge ideas on results. I don't know what else you would judge them on. And then John Dewey was another leader, and he said ideas are instrument of actions, and he focused on labor and women's rights. He wanted peace, and he promoted education. Now we have Clemens or Mark Twain. I honestly don't know why they threw this in here, but they did. And he led the local color movement, which basically remembered unurbanized America, so rural America. And if you've read any of Mark Twain's books, they're all about nature and the South and all that stuff. And he was the first Western writer, because he actually moved out west to California for a while, so he was the first Western writer. Literary naturalism. So these guys were young liberal rebels, and they said that humans are a part of nature, and humans are just animals trying to survive. And all these groups had a lot of social criticisms. They were criticizing social things. They weren't being criticized. They were social rights activists. And they were led by Henry George, and he criticized the wealth gap. He was like, there's not really a middle class, there's just a bunch of wealthy people and there's a bunch of working people. He said that people who work land aren't really working land, because the wealthy tended to be people who were working land and had farms. He said that the land works for itself, so they're not actually doing a lot of work because the land is growing stuff, they're facilitating that work, as opposed to the working class of factories where they're making everything raw. So you want to tax these people more because they weren't doing as much work, but they were getting paid more, or they had a greater income. Then we also have Thorstein Veblen. He was an economist. He was saying that land is important to the economy, and that business greed was causing inefficiency because people were focusing on how to get money instead of how to be more efficient and help everything move along. Yeah, the social gospel. So there were lots of social reforms, and so now we're going to talk about the rise of institutional church. So at first, churches didn't focus on philanthropy. They were more God and faith and stuff, but then they started to develop some things like the YMCA and other social clubs like this, the Salvation Army, and so now they're basically trying to put the social life in the community above religion. And so now churches are starting to develop gymnasiums and other social facilities. So instead of going to church just being God, it was trying to build a community. And they believe that this would help people's faith. Okay, religious reformers. So there weren't a lot of urban churches at the time, and there wasn't a lot of time for churches because people were working all the time. And that goes back to the thing I said before. where they're not worried about eternal life. They're worried about life right now. So they're more worried about how they're going to pay the bills than get into heaven. So there were a lot of street preachers instead of churches, and these street preachers couldn't actually hold like full services. What they said was live like a good Christian, and these Christian ideals were like a good person, or being a good person, and they said that was more important than rituals like going to church. And this movement was led by Baptist Walter Rauschenbusch. Early efforts of urban reform. So the settlement house movement. So settlement houses helped slum dwellers. That's important. You should know that. Jane Addams and Ellen Stars developed the Hull House, which helped slum dwellers. And it was staffed by college-trained women. And they focused on the need of working poor and not, like, preaching stuff like, this is how you need to live. They're like, you know what, we're just going to help you out. And, like, yeah. And so they set up kindergartens and nurseries for infants and small children so mothers could work more. And they sponsored health clinics, lectures, art, music, and training in bookbinding and other, like, specialties. Some of them were